Welcome to the One Advantage podcast, exploring the intersections of peer power, culture, and agility. Your hosts, Mike Richardson, Jason Richmond, and Leo Bottary, co-founders of the One Advantage community of practice and advantage peer groups. For more information, please visit us at the One Advantage podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the One Advantage podcast, and I have been looking forward to this one. We are going to explore the advisory advantage, and to help us do that today, we have a phenomenal guest who's a newfound friend of mine, Udo Doring. Welcome, Udo.
Thank you very much for having me, Mike. Thrilled to be on.
Yeah, and everybody, you'll notice right out of the gate, he's got one of those strange accents, rather like I have, although mine is kind of blended out to sort of be some kind of mid-Atlantic. Udo, you are presently based in London, but temporarily back in Brisbane in Australia right now, correct?
That is right. So excuse the accent for everyone that isn't from our part of the world. I'll try and tone it down as much as I can, but normally based in the UK in London, and find myself back in a Queensland summer, which has been lovely.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. And everybody, you've already noticed that Jason and Leo are not here today. I gave them the week off so that we could have a very focused conversation, Udo and I. And I have no idea where Leo and Jason are. They're all over the world all the time doing their great work on peer innovation and culture. And no doubt we will catch up with them in a couple of weeks' time when we do the next one. And so, yes, everybody, we are going to talk about the advisory advantage and what is it? And, you know, in our work around the One Advantage of peer-powered cultures of agility, we see a confluence of needs developing in business these days. And that is this accelerating, disruptive change that we're in all the time. It's putting our future at risk more and more and more. And the challenge of future-proofing ourselves is getting harder and harder and harder, which is why more and more companies and professionals are developing what we call an advisory advantage through some different mechanisms. They might be participating in external peer advisory boards. They might be doing internal peer innovation, as Leo calls it, which is internal peer forums, powering, supercharging innovation. And not least of all, of course, they might be developing corporate and business advisory boards, which is what we're going to talk about today, because there has been a rising tide of interest in those for larger companies and for corporates in particular, many of whom already have a rigorous governance board process. And yet they know that to develop that advisory advantage, they also need an advisory board as well. And there is just no better person to explore that with us than our guest today, Udo Doring. It's great to have you here, Udo. And in the interest of full disclosure, everybody, I met Udo, I don't know, probably almost a year ago now, when I discovered the Advisory Board Center and got involved and became a certified chair. And it's just been a great experience so far. So Udo, I mean, you're the chairman of the Advisory Board Center. You've had various board roles across Australia, Asia, and the UK. You were previously the CEO and president of the Australian Pathway Education Group based in Shanghai. So you've had a lot of time in China. How did you get into this space of advisory boards?
Thanks, Mike. A really good question, and one that is a bit of a journey. So, and it is related to the genesis story of the Advisory Board Center as an organisation. I had the good fortune of working with a lady by the name of Louise Brockman, who is the founding managing director of the Advisory Board Center in a previous business. And it was based in Australia, operating domestically in Australia and New Zealand, and a really profitable business. but we were struggling with the concept of internationalization and how we take that business, which was a human resource and business strategy organization. How do we take that organization and what we were delivering in Australia and take that to other parts of the world? And what we realized in that conversation was that what we had sitting around the table in terms of our advisory structure, so our accountants and our lawyers, were probably not going to be the advisors that were going to help us get to the next stage. And Louise established an advisory board, and we worked with that advisory board for 5 years, and we managed to grow the business to 135 offices in 8 countries.
Wow!
And then
what a story!
And it was a lot of fun, and I think one of those things that when you're in it, perhaps it becomes a little bit more normal. But what I quickly realized after that experience, so after we exited that business and I moved into other guises, other sort of professional environments, you realize the value that a structure like an advisory board brought to the table. And we can dig into sort of the differences between governance structures and advisory boards, but that really started the journey. And it's been going from there.
So you really lived this sort of from the inside out. Then you've enjoyed the advantage of that advisory equation that you put together, and it really helped you springboard to that international footprint that you developed. That's fantastic. And so, go ahead.
No, so absolutely. And I think one of the things that we talk about when we reflect on that experience was the advisory board didn't necessarily do the work.
Right.
What they did in their positioning was around providing us a discipline and a structure to be able to test thinking and road test strategy. And that was the real value. So when we were making decisions as an organization, we had confidence in those decisions. And so that was the distinction, and really did add a lot of value to the organization.
Oh, I really like that. I in a lot of the work that we do around the One Advantage and the agility piece of that in particular, really in many ways, the bottom line is, in the face of craziness and accelerating disruption and global challenges and all of that kind of stuff, how do you stay composed in the face of all of that? I like to call it agile composure, which really gives you agile confidence, right? Which is, well, no matter what, to some degree, we can be quietly confident that we can handle whatever might come at us because we have a radar scope that is sufficiently robust to see it coming early enough that we've got chance to adjust. Tell us more about this confidence factor that you enjoyed by virtue of having a good advisory board equation.
So the distinction that I make, and I'm conscious that we can get into some jargon and some terminology that perhaps isn't everyday
with
people.
With an Australian accent as well. That would be perfect.
where there's some confused listeners and watchers, I can imagine. But the distinction that I think is important to make is around governance boards and advisory boards. And governance boards, a well-trodden path, really valuable to organizations, but a structure that has been around in business, in commerce for a very long time. And that is a decision-making body. An advisory board is a problem-solving body. And so the key distinction there is that an advisory board, the very notion of an advisory board is to challenge thinking, is to have conversation, is to explore ideas, to road test, but ultimately the decision remains with the organization. So whether that's the CEO, whether that's the founder of the organization or the executive team. So you hopefully that starts painting a bit of a picture for the difference.
Yeah.
So when we talk about confidence, there's a different hat and a lens that you walk into an advisory board meeting with. And my journey perhaps was reversed in terms of my board exposure, because I was exposed to advisory boards before I was governance boards. And so the advisory board experience was very much about walking into an organization, walking into the advisory board meeting with a clear idea of what we wanted to address in terms of challenges, opportunities, priorities, and road testing some of that to think, this is where we're at. This is what the business has done in the last 12 months, 3 months, whatever that period is. And then say, this is where we're thinking of heading. What do you think? For people that have been there, that have different lenses, that have different ideas around things, to say, are we missing something? Is this sound? What would you do? How would you come at this? Are there questions that you would ask that we haven't yet? And knowing that you walk out of that room, not necessarily with all the answers, but some more questions to be able to point and focus in on before you ultimately make the decision. And so that was the confidence builder, because then when you did land on something, it wasn't you making a decision in a vacuum. It was actually having really thrashed some of this conversation out.
Yeah, and I love the concept of road testing or stress testing. You remember how much we used that phrase, didn't we, when we were coming back out of the Great Recession? All the banks all of a sudden had to stress test their debt portfolios and all of that kind of stuff. So stress testing, road testing, in other words, kick in the tires on our strategy, on our structure, on our go-to-market plans before a crisis to make sure that we're crisis ready, opportunity ready, and we can navigate forward with more confidence, that because we've put ourselves through the paces beforehand. Awesome. So then to finish off the story, what gave rise to the Advisory Board Center? How did that kind of spin up out of all of this story that you were telling us earlier?
Well, if we go back to the sort of the early to mid 2000s, we exit the business, and if I'm not speaking too much out of school, Louise slept for a little while. She celebrated for a little while, and I think anyone that's been on that entrepreneurial journey will understand that there is a sigh of relief to have a decompression. Exactly, to be able to not be thinking about this thing all the time, and so there was a brief period of enjoyment. And then what ended up happening off the back of the exit and I guess that journey was that we had people that came out of our business ecosystem that said, can you either help fix what we have sitting around the table, or can you build an advisory board like you had on your business? Because we want a bit of that. We want to be able to grow a business, expand, whatever it may be. And what we quickly realized in that process was it's the Wild West, or it was the Wild West. And what I mean by that is advisory boards in the sector is, broadly speaking, unregulated and unlegislated in the vast majority of the world. So you have situations where you're walking into rooms and there's conflicts of interest, there's ethical questions that perhaps aren't being answered, there's lack of clarity of scope. So what are we actually in the room to talk about, and what are we not talking about? No impact measurement. And so really what we observed is it came down to chemistry, and the chemistry between the chair and the CEO of the organization, to say if there was alignment and if there was a chemistry in that relationship, then perhaps there was a positive impact. But if not, then more often than not, there wasn't. And so that led us to ask the question, did we just get lucky? What does good look like? And what is best practice in this space? And so that set us on a journey. Louise and myself worked in different guises, but spent the better part of 5 years researching the market and that alignment and relationship between governance and business growth. And spent time in North America, spent time in Europe, and then also in the Asia Pacific region, validating and testing models and thinking around the advisory board space. And in 2016, we launched the Advisory Board Center. And the Advisory Board Center is the global professional body for the advisory board sector. There's more to unpick in that, but that was really the journey. So out of lived experience, it was really, how do we make this something that can be repeatable and impactful for organizations that are embarking on this, as opposed to just left to chance. Yeah.
And you said the global body, right? So, I mean, very much out in front, possibly even the only professional body certifying chairs with a research-based best practice framework and all of the other good things, as you said, that we can unpick. And so that's That's a very noble work as well, Udo, to change the sector.
Look, and thank you, and absolutely, we have a really devoted team that work tirelessly to that end, and it really is, having seen the impact and seen the difference this can make to people's lives, in terms of entrepreneurs and CEOs and executives and government officials and those that are running charities and not-for-profit organisations. It's something that very much is built into our DNA to make sure that we are trying to add as much value as we can to that ecosystem. And sometimes it's a lonely place to be in terms of the advisory board space. But what we are observing is there's been huge growth in the sector across a lot of different markets. So we're active now in over 20 markets. And it's been refreshing to see organizations and individuals really lean into the structures. And I'd be interested in your opinion in terms of what you're seeing in the Americas.
Yeah, and everybody, we'll put obviously the website for the Advisory Board Center in the show notes. In addition, Udo and I did a webinar a few weeks ago where we were looking at the kind of the state of the nation and tales from the trenches. We'll put that link in the show notes as well, because we covered a lot of great ground there. And not least of all, Udo, you shared data from the State of the Market report that you do every 2 years. And there'll be another version of that in 2023. And there's some really interesting trends taking shape in there. As you said, there's been explosive growth of advisory boards globally, not least of all here in the USA and in the UK. Tell us more about why do you think that is? Why is there such a rising tide of interest in advisory boards over and above what you've already mentioned?
There's some trends that we're observing in the market across the board, and I should unpack that a little bit more in terms of the types of organisations that we're seeing engaged with the structures as well. If you had have asked us 5 years ago, it was very much business sector focused. So that was really our traditional market when it came to advisory boards. So think 1.5 to $100 million turnover, that rough range. What we've seen in the past 5 years is really the adoption of advisory boards in a lot of different guises. So that business sector remains very active and growth focused. So over 80% of organisations that establish an advisory board do so because there is a trigger around growth. So they're looking to expand international markets. They're looking to grow the organisation. They're looking at succession planning. But oftentimes the overarching theme is growth. The significant growth sector that we have seen in the last couple of years is the corporatized advisory boards.
Right.
And you mentioned it earlier, which is essentially organizations that have very established governance infrastructure. So they have a governance board and they have that ecosystem. And then within that, they're establishing advisory boards. And again, they're to touch on issues of complexity and or individual strategies within that broader ecosystem. So when we talk about the why, we certainly are seeing a number of trends, but ultimately I think the number one trend is the agenda is getting bigger.
Yeah.
And we see that across the board for organizations. So we're having lived through COVID, we had supply chain issues, we had public health considerations. Moving into 2022, we're now really seeing the pinch around energy transition and ESG and cost of living. We see geopolitical risk increasing that's affecting more and more businesses. We're seeing an aging population in much of the world, and so succession planning is becoming more acute. And so when you look at those complexities, essentially the agenda that's sitting in front of a CEO and or a traditional governance board, directors, shareholders,
right,
it's exponentially expanding.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we do, sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah. No, keep going. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that we do observe is then on the governance board side of things, we're seeing governance boards shrink. And so, and this is a global trend that's been identified by the Financial Times out of the UK in their latest governance report, and also a number of other organisations. And so, you can see the friction there between a smaller group of people having to really deal with a complex, volatile agenda that continues to grow. And so how do you address those things? How do you tap into experience and or build confidence in your decision making when you are not the content expert?
I really like that. I really like that, and the idea that the agenda, everybody, is getting bigger and faster and more dynamic and more ambiguous and more volatile. The agenda is just changing, and it's, if we're not careful, of course there are plenty of exceptions to the rule here, if we're not careful, the governance board is becoming a part of the problem because it just isn't able to get through that agenda as dynamically as it needs to. And to some degree, again, exceptions to the rule, the advisory board is part of the solution to that problem if you're not careful. To sort of add on, as Udo said earlier, add on this supplement to the thinking system, to the problem-solving system, to the options generation system, and make sure that radar scope scanning is as rigorous and extensive and future-oriented as it needs to be. I did write down a few additional agenda items for our conversation today, but I'm not sure we're going to have time. I did want to talk about cricket, so we can confuse everybody. I did want to talk about...
We're going to lose everyone.
Yeah, rugby. The English and the Australians have a lot of tension around cricket, rugby. And of course, congratulations on getting to the World Cup. And you gave yourselves a great showing there. And England are still in, so I'm still clutching on to hopes and dreams of England progressing through the World Cup. But we'll
I think the early mail is that you're in with a good shot, and I think if we Australia fell to Argentina, and I think if you're going to lose to a team in the World Cup, that is a noble and worthy opponent to lose to. So I think Australia still has a smile on its face from the week that's been.
Yeah. Anyway, back to business, everybody. Sorry for that little detour, but I just couldn't resist it, Udo. So, Udo, if you sort of step out 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and you sort of imagine that future, where do you think advisory boards are going, and what do you think that future might look like for advisory boards and the role that they play with corporates and business and startups and all of the above?
The outlook is continued growth, and I think it will be quite aggressive growth as well. And I think that is representative of that growing agenda and the complexity and variability of those issues. One of the things that we are seeing at the moment is the use or the adoption of advisory boards for project work. Project advisory boards, and they're shorter in their nature, but we are seeing a significant increase, and this is across the board. So very large corporates are engaging with these structures, as well as the business sector and emerging businesses as well. And to a certain degree, government. So I think if we fast forward 3 to 5 years, I think we will continue to see an increase in project advisory boards. To give context to growth levels, since 2019, we've seen a 52% growth in advisory boards globally.
Wow.
And
that's amazing.
We're digging into some data at the moment in terms of a research report that will be released at the beginning of next year. And what it's looking like is since that statistic, we've seen an additional, and it's we need to finalize the numbers, but it's over 20% growth in addition to that. So you're seeing that continue to grow. So I think that's certainly one part. I think another prediction or outlook that we would talk to is regulation. We think regulation will come into the market around advisory boards, and we're already seeing early signs of what that looks like. And apologies for people in different parts of the world. And I'm going to talk to an Australian example, but we have seen regulation enter our aged care sector here. So all aged care providers in Australia now, and there's over 1,000 of them, must have an advisory board as part of their oversight or management structure. And that legislation was passed about a month ago, and it comes into full effect in 2023. So what that looks like is essentially a concentration or a focus on organizations that have vulnerable customers or clients, and we do think that's going to be a bit of a trend. So think organizations that are dealing with children and health services, those sorts of organizations. So that's certainly something that we are very conscious of. And then the other I think is the increase of corporatized advisory boards and the way that corporates engage with problem-solving bodies. And again, a significant trigger that we've seen very recently, and this is a global phenomenon, but again, I can talk to a sort of an Asia-Pacific focus, but at the moment, there's been some very high-profile cyber attacks in the Asia-Pacific region, so in Australia and Singapore related. And what that's meaning for organizations of all sizes is that they're needing to engage with some bigger thinking and some planning that is relatively quick. What we're finding or what we're observing is that there are a lot of governance boards that are really struggling with the content expertise. So they're looking at making decisions on things that they're not necessarily well versed in, and so they're using advisory boards to perhaps do some of the heavy lifting for them to be able to put them in a better position to make a confident decision around what that looks like. So I think we're going to continue to see corporatized advisory boards increase as well.
Yeah, so you're beginning to hear it here first, everybody. The explosion of interest in advisory boards of more and more organizations and corporates and businesses and charities leveraging the advisory advantage. And obviously, you got to be careful, everybody, our listeners, that if you're not, then you might find yourself at an advisory disadvantage at just the wrong time when the world is getting even crazier. And perhaps, as Udo just said, there may be more regulations coming our way very soon with those populations that need extra help to be safe and secure and protected. And, here in the States in particular, Udo, I'm sure it's the same in the UK, consumer protection generally in a business to consumer context is a very acute concern, in particular for those populations that you mentioned. So everybody pay attention to this space of advisory boards. And I think, as we talked about in the webinar, Udo, you're now located in the UK because we see a lot of trends there taking shape around advisory boards. Likewise here in the States, and in many ways, everybody here in the USA, which is the biggest market by far for advisory boards, of course, we see that advisory boards are simultaneously mature and immature. They're mature in that they're widely adopted, but often immature in terms of their structure and their process and their rigor really not being where it needs to be. Some of the tendencies that Udo mentioned earlier. And so having a research-based best practice framework and the kind of independency of certified chairs and advisors and all of that becomes crucially important to really leverage that advisory advantage. And final thoughts, Udo, as we begin to land this plane. You're in Australia right now. You'll be heading back to the UK before too long. What do you imagine taking shape in the UK and Europe? And when am I going to see you in my backyard over here in the USA and California?
2023 is really looking exciting for us, and Mike, I think this is probably the same for a lot of organisations. But we're spending our time at the moment planning for what's next, and so the last few years have been constrained around travel and COVID, and will things happen face to face or not? And so we're really excited. We've got some American activations planned for next year, so we'll be in market a number of times, but definitely in June for some delivery and events and engagement with organisations. So that's terrific. We also have the same in Europe, so both in the UK, in London, and in continental Europe as well. So a really exciting year for that side. And then what we're seeing in terms of the interest in advisory boards, it's increasing, and we see that as a responsibility to make sure that we have really good conversations and measured conversations with either the organisations that are looking at scoping them or improving what they have, and all the individuals that are engaging in the space, because it's a terrific space to engage with. It can have real impact, but there's a responsibility on both sides of that. So that will be a theme in 2023 as well, making sure that we're balancing that up. But I will be seeing you before not too long, Mike.
Good, great. Well, thanks for being here, Udo. Everybody, you heard it here first. Advisory boards are coming to your backyard bigger, faster, and sooner than you probably realize. And you should pay attention to this space, because it is a real way for you to make sure that you are not disadvantaged from an advisory point of view. Make sure that you are ahead of the curve and developing an advisory advantage. We've been blessed to have Udo Doring with us today, everybody, the chairman of the Advisory Board Centre. Thanks so much once again, Udo. There you have it, everybody. Another episode of the One Advantage podcast in the can, and we look forward to the next one. We'll see you there.
Thanks for listening to the One Advantage podcast. If you liked this episode, please consider helping us by rating us wherever you listen, spreading the word, having us as a guest on your podcast or webinar, and mentioning us in social media. Find us at the One Advantage podcast, where you can get more information about us and this episode. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to more great episodes to come.